I just wanted to say, it's so nice to see all of you out there. When we had our initial call for this panel, I was talking to Nanne and Andrea, and they said last year when they did their panel, there were 8 people in the audience. It gets better. As soon as Andrea started to talk, 2 of them left.
Lovely.
So in any case, we're delighted to see such a good
I better
audience.
not talk first.
I just want to sort of set the stage for you before I turn it over to these amazing men here. You know, with the art market having increased almost threefold in global transactions over the last 13 years, and with individual prices being extraordinary over the past 10 years or so, we can definitely say that art is an asset class. Now, with that comes the problem that with an increase in art prices, people's asset allocations have become out of balance. So we'll see a lot of times now that art collectors have their art assets heavily outweighing their real estate or equities. Art used to be considered a static asset class, but we know now that with this wonderful facility of loans against art, it now works for you. So that's what we're going to be talking about today primarily. I wanted to introduce you now to our distinguished panelists, and I'll go from my left onwards. Andrea Danese here is president and founder of Athena Art Finance. His clients are a who's who of collectors in the art world looking for liquidity for their art assets. Next to him, you know Evan Beard, who is National Art Executive for U.S. Trust Bank of America. He oversees a staggering $6.5 billion art loan book, and he assists the bank's high net worth clients in planning for their art assets. Next to him is Mitchell Zuckerman. Mitchell brings over 40 years experience as a corporate attorney, Sotheby's general counsel, head of Sotheby's business development, founder of Sotheby's Financial Services, and now an advisor to private clients. And finally, Nanne Dekking on the far left. Nanne is CEO and co-founder of Artory, which is working to bring transparency to an opaque art market, to assist in helping collectors navigate the complexities of issues that surround the collecting of and maintaining their art collections. So there are any number of ways now that have been developed to have art be used to defer taxes or other strategies. That includes 1031 exchanges, which is transferring like kind for like kind art, putting art into trust, using various facilities of moving art to museums for a particular period of time in order to waive or defer use tax, and also private art museums. There are about 42 now in this country alone. However, one of the most useful ones, one of the ones that is taking up most of our time now is art as an asset class, art being used for loan as collateral for loans. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So, Andrea, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you the following question to start off the conversation. What are some of the reasons clients come to you to take a loan against their art?
One basic reason: they need money. By the way, it was raining a lot last year when that panel was not so well attended, just to be completely clear. But, you know, I usually go around and say lending an art as a collateral is a relatively new phenomenon. It fundamentally is a lie, because Mitch here has been doing this he's really the father of this. He started 30 years ago, maybe. I lost track of it, but what I would say, the difference is that it started as effectively of a byproduct or a collateral product in the auction world and within auction houses. It's now evolved in the last 5, 6, 7 years into something that is almost like a standalone product, away from the traditional market participant in the art market. They continue to do that, clearly, but now there are other other participants like us, like other firms in Europe, and the banks that have clearly start paying attention to art as an asset class on the balance sheet of their clients, as an asset class that usually locks in a significant amount of money and liquidity that can be used. Why people want to borrow against art? Reason spans across the board. People borrow against art because truly they need money. You got a big IRS bill and you don't know how to deal with that. And you suddenly realize that you already have a mortgage, you already have borrowed money against your securities account, a Merrill Lynch or US Trust or Bank of America, and the asset that you have probably more dollars hanging on your walls than you have in your walls, meaning the value of your own property. So there is the realization that if you figure out a way to extract value without having to sell it, because that's clearly the key point from the art that you have on your walls, suddenly you have access to liquidity that was not accessible before, was not available before. As I said, so what I would call life events, the sudden bill from the IRS, or your daughter gets married and she wants the $3 million kind of wedding. But also investment. Investment means that the money that gets freed up from the art that you own gets used to buy more art. Collectors that don't want to sell something to acquire a new piece. That's the part that I like the most because it's really the part where the money gets reinvested into the art market and effectively continue to build the market and expand the market. Some very savvy and more sophisticated art collectors and borrowers, they use that money for private equity deals. You clearly need to find assets where you reinvest your money that have returns that are greater than the cost of borrowing it, otherwise the math doesn't work. But fundamentally, that's how it gets used at a collector level. Then there are other participants in the market, like dealers, for instance, or the same auction houses that borrow money against their inventory purely because that's a way to grow their business, as a way to create liquidity and continue to grow the volume of transactions that they can perform in the market. This is kind of what you observe out there and the type of use that you have. But fundamentally, I mean, I would say, once you borrow money, then you use the money for whatever you may need that money for. It's becoming very popular with real estate developers. They have exhausted access to bank credit. The bank is not going to fund more of their project. But they have sometimes incredible art collections. That's the way they fund effectively the extra equity to complete the project. So it's expanding and it's becoming more and more a mainstream tool accepted by the market as another source of liquidity alongside your real estate, your securities, your general bank credit, if you like.
Thanks. Evan, how do you differentiate U.S. Trust, Bank of America as a lender from somebody like an Athena?
Sure. So Andrea mentioned that early on it was Mitch here doing transactions. He'll talk a bit about some of those transactions in the 80s that were really seminal. They were transactions to get, I won't speak on his behalf, but really to get consignments at auction and to, get buyers to, lever their art to buy major work. So it started out as a transactional device, really in the auction world. And then the banks really took notice and said, look, this is an asset class. There's a lot of capital that our clients are locking up in what is a cash negative asset. And over time, really through the 90s, we at U.S. Trust started to say, look, this is a cash negative asset. We can keep it on the wall. There's a legal infrastructure here in the United States that allows us to perfect our interest in the art, that will allow our clients to unlock capital to deploy in other parts of their financial life. So this started out reasonably small, and our art loan book was really an accommodation for our top clients through the 90s. But there's been a philosophical shift, really in the last 15 years. For the first time, really in history, financial institutions globally have discovered that there's a real need for this. For whatever reason, the connoisseur and the aesthete collector shifted to more of a trophy hunter, markets-driven collector, and that shift has really driven a huge demand to unlock capital from their art. People are buying art for cultural capital, status, aesthetics, all the reasons they've been buying, since the Renaissance. But in the last 15 years, low interest rates, as well as, a markets-driven mindset from the types of folks that have developed and created a lot of the wealth, the real estate, private equity, and hedge fund set. So we've seen this supercharged growth. Our art loan book's gone from $1 billion to $6 billion in a very short amount of time. And we see about $18 billion in outstanding art loans in the market right now, which has added a lot more liquidity to the space. So the difference here is it's gone from it's gone from transactionally driven back in the 80s to now financially driven, where collectors just have elevated their art to the overall balance sheet and now are using their art in strategic ways. That's a philosophical shift, and we're still, I think, in the early innings of that.
Will you guys loan against my classic cars?
You know what, we've done two. You know, classic cars are a pain in the neck because you have to drive the collateral. You can't just keep it in a garage. It actually needs to be driven. And it's a very small market compared to the art world, and it's a very new market. Classic cars is, you know, a 70-year-old asset class. Art, you know, has a history back to the Renaissance and before. So we're dipping our toe into the classic car space, but very slowly.
I just want to add one point. I'll do it, but I want to put a point in there that actually I'm sure Nanne will jump at it. Cars have a VIN number, which makes an enormous difference. Title is pretty sure you know what you're lending against. When we lend against art,
you're stealing away my opening line, my friend.
Now you owe me.
My opening line.
All right, I'm going to turn this over to Nanne, but I'm just going to say, Nanne, we've all heard that Wall Street Journal and New York Times said the art market is the largest legal economy to be largely unregulated. How do clients protect themselves, and take us through what clients should know before they buy something?
I love the way how you asked this question. By the way, this is the best prepared panel ever. If you ever want to be in a panel, make sure Liz organizes it. Because usually it's like 3 days in advance, you vaguely remember there was a panel. What was the subject?
It was a week ago we started talking about this.
So Liz, thank you for that. You know, the client should ask questions. If you buy art, you should ask questions. You already mentioned the car. Well, I happen to have a tiny little farm in Italy where I have a Hyundai Santa Fe built in 2002, which was definitely not the biggest acquisitions I've ever made in my lifetime. My son, by the way, thought for a long time it was the most beautiful car in the world. He's now 13, so he's now very embarrassed that we own a Hyundai Santa Fe. But the Hyundai Santa Fe has everything you don't have when you buy an artwork, and that's staggering. So these gentlemen try to build a business on an asset of which you don't have any guarantee. You don't know a thing about it. And we've seen it, see Jamie Niven here. Jamie and Mitchell, when we were at Sotheby's, I'm a so-called expert. I was an expert for a long time in Impressionist art and the vice chairman and head of private sales at Sotheby's. They always called us in meetings at the very last moment. Mitchell had to make a decision, surrounded by art historians who had to talk about the value of the work. When I was not at the valuation, I can tell you the price was always lower because I've worked at Wildenstein, so my valuation is always higher. So that's already how unrealistic putting valuations on artworks is. It's a fact. When Nanne was not in a valuation meeting, the valuation was always lower. Then, nobody knew anything about the condition of the work. So what we need is standardization. My Hyundai has a number. My Hyundai has a little booklet, which is actually a legal document. I know exactly what kind of repairs has been done to my beautiful old car since 2002 on a yearly basis. If I don't have that booklet, I cannot sell the car. So I don't want to sell my own company here, but that's exactly what we're doing right now. We're creating a standardized digital solution helped by a very big software company, SAP, and very much connected with the newest techniques. And I have the funny feeling it's going to be a success. And I'm telling you that for one reason, and I stop. Tom Postma, who made the designs of this amazing fair, he's Dutch. Well, you know already after my third word that I am Dutch. But Tom and I spoke with an art advisor here at the fair, who I've known for many years, since '96. And he asked me, what are you doing? And I gave him an idea of the digital registry that we're building. And he got furious. He said, the art world used to be so much fun, and you're going to destroy it. Yes. And Tom Postma, who doesn't know anything about art, he said, Nanne, I think you're onto something. I mean, what you've just said is exactly what we need to change. You can be more successful, and the buyers, because that was your initial question, they should ask I want to have more standardization. Why is there not a standardized restoration report on an artwork? Isn't it a joke? I remember vividly that we were talking about the financing of a painting by most of the most important artists in the world. And a few days after, we found out there was a tear in the canvas, a repair. Anyway, that was my point.
No, and what he's doing is important. I mean, we're keeping an eye on it very closely because this is the one segment of the economy where opinions matter more than facts. And even as we look at a collection of art, you know, it's probably more important for us, the reputation of the borrower at this point than the underlying asset. I mean, we are, you know, recourse lenders, so we look at the balance sheet, the cash flow, but reputation at this point is the most important thing we look at. Is the borrower right now, does he have a history of treating his bankers well? Does he have a history and a great reputation in the market? What you're doing may actually allow us to soften that a bit, and we'll keep it. And it's part of a broader trend, I think, of, you know, more transparency. You already see pricing databases. You're seeing databases of lost and stolen work. And so it'll be interesting to see if this market goes from, as you said, you know, this romantic, very opaque world of mysterious things to a real asset class that actually lives up to an asset class that has pricing, has official ways of valuation, has official reports on title. We're not there yet. Which is partly why hedge fund and private equity guys are attracted to the space. Information is valuable in this space because right now it's still a very efficient market.
And just two more words, and then I let Mitchell speak because I'm sure he has a ton of stories for us about this type of issues. That's exactly even more important to us because as Evan pointed out, they are a full recourse lender. So God forbid something goes wrong with the art, Evan still has the ability to go after other assets of the borrower. Yeah. We are a non-recourse lender. God forbid something goes wrong, I'm stuck. I'm stuck with a piece of art that may have a tear and I didn't notice the tear when I lent the money. A piece of art that may not be entirely authentic. There may be an issue, there may be stolen, so on. So this is a market that is clearly evolving rapidly. One thing, and which is to a certain extent collateral to what Nanne was saying, think about what happened yesterday, or Monday morning. Yeah, Monday morning. When Paul Manafort was arrested, the next thing that came out on the Wall Street Journal, how did he launder his money? He bought old masters, furniture, and rugs. That's exactly the panic we have every day. Where is the money coming from? Who's buying it? What is the provenance? Was anyone in that chain of provenance? All this information, we need to rebuild it from scratch every day. If Nanne can do it for us, I'm happy to pay money.
But Andrea, isn't one of the most important things a good appraisal?
That's absolutely, but that's not even a good appraisal. That's elite's appraisal.
No, but I mean, aren't appraisals sort of the basis of all the determinations that you all make?
Sure, but that makes you a client of Nanne too, because
well,
you
makes
will
you,
that's
I mean, the real power of what you're doing is that you're an independent art appraiser. And that's a different story. Because appraising art is usually done by the marketplace and for the marketplace. And is there any other market where that happens? I mean, am I naive?
No, there's no licensing of appraisers.
Yep.
It's a very
And we've been dealing with an old master paintings together, a very famous painting by Leonardo, where various scholars have completely different opinions. So you have to know who the right scholar is. You know what I'm so fed up with, having been in this trade for such a long time, I don't want to trust anyone. If I trust someone, it means that I don't have all the facts. Just want to know the facts. I mean, there's so many nice people in the world, and in my business there's always, you can trust me. Sorry to have an Italian accent now, but but this whole you can trust me on the grave of my mother, forget it. Forget it.
I want Mitchell to jump in now, because Mitchell, you've been in the auction market for years and years. Now you're outside of it. Why would people go to an auction house to get a loan?
Essentially for the simplicity and the speed of one-stop shopping. This whole prelude sort of horrifies me because I mean, when you're doing it, you're just doing it from day to day, and you've got your checklist, and you go through it like a pilot taking off in an airplane, but hearing about it from a distance, there are so many perils and pitfalls that the lender has to be careful. And then that leads to the question for the prospective borrower. How do I sort through all of these things? There's so many options now, as Andrea points out. When I started the art lending business for Sotheby's in 1988, banks were certainly not doing it. There were one or two small outside lenders who tried doing it. But I saw it as an opportunity, not so much to make interest income, but to acquire things to sell and to help people buy. So as Andrea said, it was purely transactional. And the benefit that the auction house has is everything can be done in-house. We had 500 more or less art experts strewn around the world. They could act as sales force to help develop loans. When an opportunity came either from a seller who needed bridge financing because she wanted liquidity before the auction would settle 3 or 4 months in the future, or someone who wanted to buy, didn't have the cash, was willing to sell other things or to pay off buyer financing in the future, the auction house by itself could do this, and now they all do it. Sotheby's is the leader. Sotheby's still has the finance business. Christie's has a finance facility, but they never created a standalone business. They turn to people like Andrea, or they do it internally. The smaller auction houses probably would steer people. One of the things I'm doing now is there are so many, and here's my little advertorial, there are so many opportunities if you're a seller or a buyer. How do you sort that all out? Where can you go for advice? And when my partner Warren Whiteman and I left in early 2016, we realized that there was no one on the landscape who had the in-house experience, who could advise clients who wanted to borrow money or get a loan guarantee, get an auction guarantee, or get generalized advice. So we started that business, and that's what we see now. This was advertised as Perils, Pitfalls, and Adventures. And I can see that Liz wants me to talk about 2 particular adventures. Looking at it now, it looks colorful and amusing. I can tell you when it happened. It wasn't. It was horrifying. The first case was proactive lending, where the potential auction bidder was offered buyer financing, unknown to me at the time. This was in 1989, I think, or was it 87, 89. The November auction was coming up. We had, as a star lot, The Irises by Van Gogh, or Van Gogh. And Mr. Bond, who was known better for his yacht racing than his art collecting, nevertheless was collecting art. He was being advised by London dealers Angela Neville and Billy Keating. Billy since deceased. Angela still very much with us. I'm dealing with her today. He was offered, and I'm putting this in the passive sense to not name names, not me, he was offered to borrow for up to 2 years 50% of whatever the painting cost if he were the successful bidder. He became the successful bidder. His total ticket was, as you see, $54 million. I was told at that point that he was offered this credit facility, and he wanted to take the picture home with him to his office in Perth, Western Australia, and please figure out how to have that happen and us not take any risk in so doing. So I figured it out. The picture went with him to Western Australia. He had 2 years to pay with an interest rate I think was probably prime +3. At the end of the 2 years, we found out, or he could not pay us back, and so my task was to retrieve the irises. And not wanting to go to Western Australia, Billy Keating volunteered to go and to retrieve it. He brought it back. I looked at it. It looked okay. We then embarked on trying to sell it privately in order to recover the financing. I remember in the course of that, we were negotiating through several intermediaries, as one always did, with an alleged Japanese buyer who was willing to pay $60 million for it, which would have given Bond a nice profit and would have gotten my loan repaid. That went on for weeks, and then the intermediaries went silent, and then finally I got one of them and said, "What are you doing? I thought we had a deal." And the intermediary told me, "We're sorry, but the principal's astrologer has now told him that this is not an auspicious time to close that deal." Then, as everybody knows, a call was made to the Getty, and it ended up at the Getty where it now resides. Getty paid an undisclosed amount, which was enough to repay the loan, and there it is. That was financing that we offered in order to sell the painting for the benefit of Sotheby's and the seller.
Did you make money on the deal?
We made a lot of money on the deal. We made money primarily on the buyer's premium, and then through other collateral that we took, we sold a lot of bonds, the remaining collection. So we got a lot of turnover out of the deal that was all commissioned.
And very briefly, this was the most important transaction from a market's perspective, because a lot of the financial firms took note. I talked to our risk folks. They point to this transaction. This was the time when the bank said, wait a second, is this the next great asset class to lend against? So this misadventure that turned into a good adventure for you really launched a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Mitch, sorry, I want to add something that is also a question to you.
I haven't got my royalty payments.
But one thing that you mentioned, which I find it very interesting, is that I believe he bought it in auction at $54 million, and Sotheby's lent half of it, 50% of it. That's actually a very interesting point and a point of huge concern for us as a lender when we lend money to people that buy in auction or in private sales, which is how inflated and how real is the price at which they buy. The classical case I use is the Basquiat that sold at $110 million. Because this is the typical thing, you have to bid that one get run over the bus, the market doesn't exist at 110. Theoretically, you could say you've set up a price of 110, you should be lending, we lend 50% of value normally, but the reality is that far more important than price, it's really the focus on true liquidity behind that price. I mean, the work that we work with lease, on appraisal and stuff, the question we make is not where it traded, how many people were there to trade? And that makes an enormous amount of difference in managing that concern. That Basquiat 110, I may lend the money valuing it at 65, because that's where the bidding ended and only two bidders stay in the play.
Well, that's right. I said this was horrifying for me to hear because my operating rule was to lend half of the low estimate on something bought at auction, because you can't replicate the bidding contest ever again. This was an anomalous deal made. We got lucky and we closed it out. The next deal was more conventional in that sense, that we didn't violate our 50% of low estimate rule, which is the conservative rule. And by the way, in the 20 or so years I was running the finance business, we never lost any money on classic finance loans at 50%, because so long as you stick to art of good quality, so long as you're conservative in your appraisals, and so long as you check condition and everything else you have to worry about, even in the most extravagant exogenous downturn, which I saw about every 8 to 10 years, the art collateral doesn't go below 50% of value. Other things do, but it's not that volatile. And the different categories in the art market have different volatilities. Jewelry is highly volatile. Contemporary art is remarkably volatile. We never made any big loans on contemporary art at anything other than extremely conservative values. There are a lot of things to be careful about, as you guys know.
Mitchell was incredibly tough. I'll never forget that, to see all these experts begging, you have to do this deal, but not with Mitchell. That's not how it works with him.
We don't have to do that deal.
We don't have to do that deal.
I wanted to keep my job. And I'm just risk-averse by nature. The second set of photographs you see was 1989, and I checked in Google because I didn't want to name names unless it was public. Everything I'm about to tell you is public. Mr. Kamiyama was a well-known leading dealer in Tokyo in the 1980s. A lot of art was going to Japan. He was a primary factor in brokering art to Japan. So in November 1989, at the contemporary auction, he bid on and bought de Kooning Interchange, and a week later he bid on and bought the Picasso mirror that you see. The total obligation on all of that was something like $47 million for the two of them. The convention was that successful bidders had up to 30 days to pay. 30 days came, and it was just before Christmas when my then colleague David Nash called me to come to his office. In his office was Mr. Kamiyama and his translators and his entourage, explaining that they were so sorry Mr. Kamiyama got carried away at the auctions. He really didn't have $47 million, but it shouldn't be a problem because we can just sell those pictures to somebody else. That would have been fine, except we had two consigners who would have conceived that to be a problem. And legally, we could have canceled the sales for non-payment, but those were two record prices. And had we announced the cancellation of those sales, it would have shaken the art market, not to mention our company. So I, through translators, I told Mr. Kamiyama, sorry, you have to pay. He said, well, I can't pay. My principal won't pay. And he said, what will you do to me to make me pay? And I said, well, you'll be introduced to lawyers, and we'll sue you. And he said, if you sue me, I'll kill myself. And I took that to be a credible threat. And I said, no, let's not start killing ourselves. I got on the phone with the two different consigners. One was a collector who was fairly ill-tempered at that point. The other was the executor to an estate who was a little bit more patient. And I said, we're having a small problem with our buyer. You're going to get paid. Buyer's Japanese. We just need a little bit more time, so just give me a few more weeks and we will get you paid. I didn't know if that were true, but I felt like saying it at the time. Christmas was coming up. On January 2, I flew to Tokyo. David had gone back to London to his ancestral home. Michel Strauss, the co-leader of the Impressionist department, was also in London. I called them up and I said, meet me in Tokyo, please, on January 2. We met in Tokyo on January 2. We went to Mr. Kamiyama's sort of nondescript apartment. And during the next week, through translators, we negotiated what we called buyer financing, in which we would loan him the $47 million. We would disperse that money to the two sellers, and he would consign pictures to the upcoming sales in May 1990. We did that. It makes it sound more smooth than it actually happened. We couldn't actually, going to your point, Nanne, we couldn't see his painting collection itself because in the first week in January, everything is closed. It's a holiday week called Golden Week. The pictures were supposedly in a warehouse. Instead, Mr. Kamiyama had school kid lunch boxes and Kodachrome slides about that big, as people did in those days. And he showed us what pictures he could consign. And so he didn't even have a light box. We had Michelle and David going like this, looking at pictures. I was negotiating and writing a contract by hand. And we finished it all up, and the contract said he would ship the pictures as soon as possible to us in New York. When the pictures arrived, we opened the boxes. If they were as we thought they were, then we'd close the loan. If that didn't happen, I didn't know what the next step was, but it wouldn't be good. As I was leaving my hotel room, I got a call from New York, Sotheby's New York, saying that the seller of the interchange was fed up. He was out of patience and time. He was going to the New York Times, and he was going to be suing us that day unless we paid him. So my boss asked me whether I trusted Mr. Kamiyama to put the actual paintings into boxes and send them to New York. And I said, I did. So I recommended paying out the two sellers with our own money, which we then did do. I came back to New York, and it was a suspenseful 2 weeks. I got a call finally from the loading dock saying the boxes had arrived from Tokyo. I had never before then or since then gone downstairs to the 71st Street loading dock to see boxes come in. They could have held bricks for all I knew. I went down, they opened the first box, and the paintings were there. And then we sold them in May 1990 for about $50 million. So on that one old Japanese dealer, we had a turnover of approximately $100 million with full commission. The footnote is, in August of 1990, as you know, Iraq invaded Kuwait, the Japanese real estate market crashed, markets around the world crashed, the art market crashed. Had we not been fortunate enough to sell those paintings in May of 1990, we would have missed the boat, and I don't think we would have recovered all the money.
Wow. One comment on this. I'm not going to do this for you, okay? But to say that an auction house, exactly for what Evan was explaining before, Mitch was explaining before, can act as a principal. Effectively, they took principal risk on this transaction as part of their prerogatives, as part of the flexibility that they have, and they did it. We, and I think I can speak for you too, I don't think we would go down that road. I need those paintings in my hand before I lend you the money, and I don't trust Mr. Kamayama.
I was asked for adventures. I found this to be adventure.
This is a real adventure.
I had many other adventures, none of which were intentional. None of this was in our loan model. This was purely reactive, but underlying it, it shows that if you want to buy things at auction, you can work out financing. If you want to sell things at auction, or if you want, more importantly these days, if the circumstances warrant a guarantee, then both major auction houses will give guarantees. That's another story for another time, and they're scarier than even these deals.
I would like to add two things. First of all, if you think that we among ourselves, the art market, hear stories like this every day, no. This is an unbelievable story. I love it. I mean, really, this is your first row here, all of us. But to the credit of the marketplace, I have to say, is the auction houses do understand that things have to change. You can imagine with the product that we're building, I'm doing the rounds to all the auction houses. And I started with the auction houses because the auction houses are, after all, the most transparent marketplace. It's at least perceived as the most transparent marketplace. So we all know that the perception of the buyers is that there's something wrong with the marketplace. And there's nothing worse for any marketplace if the perception is that there's something wrong with the marketplace. I can give you just one detail is we always believe that the art market is such a huge market. It's not at all. 2% of the millennials, for example, the people who are well educated and have the money to buy art because they don't trust it. They don't trust it because of the big scandals that happen at the highest echelon of the market, and that trickles down through the whole art market. It's a little bit, to come back to my Hyundai, it's if there's one Hyundai where the airbags spontaneously explode, you cannot look at an Hyundai anymore without thinking about that tragical accident that happened because of that. I think that's exactly the state the art market is in right now. And if they want to make more money, they should become more transparent. And the old-time dealers will not understand it, but the bigger dealers do. I just became chairman of TEFAF. Why did they do that? Well, and why did I accept it? I told them, yes, I would love to become your chairman, but I have a hidden agenda. This time, a hidden agenda, which would be typical for the art market, is not that I actually happen to have a very, very influential client who, through me, now can see everything as the first. No, my hidden agenda is, guys, if you want to sell more art, you better change your act.
Wow.
Are they going to change their act?
They will, of course. They want to make money.
Right, so we've been talking now about lending to potential buyers at auction. What about lending to sellers? Andrea?
Well, this is actually one of the case studies that I gave to Liz. it's interesting because as part of that evolution of how the auction houses operate, they've also figured out that they can be very smart in the allocation of their capital and decide in a much more thoughtful way when to use their money and when to use someone else's money, in this case, ours as a lender. This is something that has picked up a lot of steam recently in the market. When I say recently, I would say in the last year, we have seen a number of this situation. Consignment to auction house provide a guarantee, but you're still not a good enough client for the auction house to give you a cash advance on that guarantee. Or better, and I use the example of Sotheby's because it's a public company, so the balance sheet of Sotheby's is available to everyone. Sotheby's has made a very deliberate, and I'm not questioning their decision there, this decision to invest a lot of their cash in doing stock buyback to sustain the stock price in the market. It's a normal strategy, everyone does that. That means that they have also kind of drained a little bit the resources of the capital that they can allocate to cash advances and partially even to their own loan book. I mean, their loan book has shrunk from 900 million to 580 million, I believe, something like that. That's the beauty of us collectively existing as lenders, that now if you come with that guarantee to me, Sotheby's is a reputable institution, the painting is a good painting, I will do the cash advance to you. So effectively, we start seeing a situation where, call it balance sheet renting from the auction houses, using a balance sheet of financial institution like ours or others, where effectively they can keep the client happy, but don't have to put out their cash. And
what's a typical deal size? Are these smaller, or are they doing it mostly on the big deals?
So far we've done, I would say, reasonably small sizes, at least compared to your world, where you operate clearly in anywhere between $2 to $10 million. So this is kind of the size of these deals. The way they are structured is interesting because they're short-term deals. Usually the payment happens within 6 to 9 months, depending if it gets sold in auction or the guarantee kicks in. We do that in a structure of a zero coupon. So there is no interest payment for the beneficiary of the guarantee. They pay us at the back end when the money is received.
For all the art advisors here, and I see quite a few of them, do they come to you saying, get ready, I'm going to the auction house, can you be the third party, or is it the auction house will make that decision and bring you in if
well,
they need
it's twofold. Sometimes I have people that come and say, I have a guarantee, can you give me a cash advance against this guarantee? In some cases, it's the auction house saying, we are going to give a guarantee, would you be interested in providing a cash advance?
Do you guys have interest rate targets, and how negotiable are the interest rates?
I'm non-negotiable. I'm a very, very integral people person. No, the interesting part about this, where on our traditional loans, I mean, because we are, as I said, a non-recourse lender, our interest rate tend to be clearly meaningful higher than the interest rate you would get from a bank where you give a personal guarantee. We lend money at LIBOR plus 700 basis points, so we're talking about 8% and slightly higher than 8%. On these deals, their structure really depend from how long the deal is. In some cases, it can be as short as 3 months. So the interest rate is effectively a lump sum payment that can vary enormously. It can be from 8 to 10% annualized. Please, I stress that annualized, which really means that if it's only for 3 months, really you are paying 3% on your money, or maybe less, 2.5%. But it's clearly slightly more expensive, but we don't receive any interest payment during the life of the loan. We receive everything at the back end. Psychologically, this works very well for the client because I'm getting cash in hand and I'm not going to pay you $1 until this either sell or the house pays the guarantee. At that point, I will receive less money because clearly I'm paying you back, but I've been effectively free from the problem of generating the cash flows to support the loan.
Evan, how about you? Interest rates.
Interest rates, it's, LIBOR plus a couple percentage points, really. So, I mean, we're a bank, we're highly regulated, we have access to the discount window, and we don't have to go through another entity, so we can be pretty aggressive on price. We can't be as nimble sometimes as these guys, but what they're doing and what Sotheby's is doing, I see in the press sometimes that, it creates inflation in the market, these aren't real prices. Actually, it's adding a lot of grease to an otherwise very thin market, and it's very good for collectors, it's very good for consigners, it's very good for the market that these instruments exist because it finally is adding a depth of liquidity which is good for everybody.
Our default position conservatively was always to have possession of the collateral because it's portable, as Nanne pointed out. Allen Bond was an exception. What are your positions on having possession?
Well, in our case, it really depends from the jurisdiction where the collateral is located. One premises. When we started this, we assumed that a lot more people wanted to maintain possession. Believe it or not, more than 80% of our portfolio is in our possession. So the demand of people retaining possession of their art is much lower than we thought was going to be. However, in the United States, we are willing to let possession with the client. You can do a UCC filing. Our preference is always to have possession by definition. It makes life easier, but we can do that. Outside the United States, it's a very different story because legally you cannot perfect the lien without having possession, or at least we have mechanisms where in some cases, particularly when we deal with dealers, we can let them possession, but there are a lot of bells and whistles that we need to build around.
We want our collectors to keep the art on the wall. We rarely take possession.
All right, I'm going to move on now to Evan. You have an interesting demographic amongst your borrowers, and we've been talking a lot about borrowing in order to buy new art. What about your other? What are your other clients?
We talk about these things in big numbers, but every single deal we do has a very interesting backstory. And so I just plucked two very recent ones. One's a loss, one's a win. A few years ago, the NFL got together, the owners, and they identified 3 cities that they would like to hold the Super Bowl in that had never hosted a Super Bowl before. One of those cities did not have enough hotel rooms to host the Super Bowl. This was a client both of our real estate bank as well as a couple other banks on the street. The NFL and this individual got together and said, look, you're a hotel developer. Can you help us partner to build enough hotels so this city can ultimately host a Super Bowl? This was a time frame we were coming off the real estate crisis. There was a very limited interest in real estate development lines on this scale to do these types of deals. So the collector came to us and came to a competitor and said, look, I got $500 million worth of art. Let me unlock some capital. Let's build some hotel rooms so we can host a Super Bowl in this city. We had the deal on the finish line to close this multi-$100-million art loan that, so this city could one day host a Super Bowl. In the 11th hour, Lloyd Blankfein from Goldman Sachs swooped in his private jet, took this client off to Bill Gates' private island, romanced him for a day, and suddenly that deal, flittered away to Goldman. Good for them. But I say this, that these deals all have interesting stories behind them, and in the next 5 years, this city will indeed host a Super Bowl, and at kickoff, I'll make sure to let you all know which city it ultimately is. The second one was a win. So a big medical professional, mega art collection, again, 500, 600 million, was very interested in the medical humanities. He partnered with Harvard Business School to really research whether or not people going through traumatic experiences, both psychologically or cancer treatments, if they do it around great art or if they're viewing great art, whether this could have any effect. And they also want to see whether doctors and nurses and medical staff, whether art around them could change their behavior in any way for the better for these folks. So he said, look, I'm going to use my art collection to fund a series of cancer research centers across the Southeast. So he unlocked about $250 million from his art collection, built a series of cancer centers. The art that's funding those cancer centers now are on the walls of those cancer centers, and they're being used for medical humanities research, etc. So that's a virtuous cycle. The art on the wall is funding the buildings that the art is hanging on, so people going through cancer treatments can get it back. So every deal we do is very interesting, and it's amazing how far we've come from chasing Japanese collectors around the world to get their money to using art collections in this way. And I think we're still in the early innings.
Great. We wanted to leave some time for questions. We have lots of other stories if there aren't any questions, but any questions out there? Anybody? We've answered all your questions, James.
Just so you know, my office was next to Mitchell for 7 years.
I do know.
And we did not have really a wall. We just had a little partition.
Right.
I can assure you that listening to Mitchell's language over those 7 years, he had more horror shows than you could ever believe. Mr. Kamanyama was just the beginning of his career in dealing with crises. But frankly, Mitchell, let me ask you the question. In your life today, you're not going to be dealing with that kind of situation. You're going to be much more dealing with estates and sellers who really want to get advice on how to finance. So your life has changed to some degree, correct?
For the better.
That's your answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to advertise.
That's it.
In the back center.
Oh, hello. As it happened, between 2000 and 2001, I have conducted numerous of interviews with the private banking in Britain, Germany, and United States. And at the time, unanimously, all the bankers said the following, that although, yes, by all means, they were involved in the concept and practice of the art as collateral, however, the way they were looking at their clients, it was in so-called larger relationship, meaning there was no way that you could just walk in and to say, I have a very important painting and I live in a rental. You had to have a house, a jewelry, and potentially a couple of cars, sort of to spread the risk. And looking at current situation, my question would be, has this dramatically changed, meaning that the art is seen more as, let's call it, hard asset, or in fact, still, which would be common sense, by the way, these transactions seen as art, art and collateral, are in fact supported by this larger relationship? So that's the question. Thank you.
This is where me and Evan can finally battle a little bit. I'll start very quickly, and then you can. Look, that's exactly when my pitch, if you like. No, the argument there is we are a pure lender. We lend exclusively against the art. I don't sell anything else. I don't run a private banking institution. I don't make fees out of you in any way. I don't have an auction house. I don't make money selling your art. So we pitch the neutrality and the lack of need of in-depth financial creditworthiness analysis of our borrowers. I focus on the art, and I hope I get it right, because I know that ultimately that's my only place where I can go if something goes wrong. I don't make money anywhere else. There is a price to pay. Then we go back to the interest rate. I charge you LIBOR plus 700. In his word, he makes money potentially across the board on multi-product. Bank in general, and Evan, correct me if I'm wrong here, but bank in general make far more money from fees in managing assets than they make from lending money. Lending money is not an exceptionally good business for a bank per se. To the point that, going back to Lloyd Blankfein, Goldman Sachs refused to make most of these loans because they think they have a better use of their capital than lending money to their private bank clients if they don't have to. But I leave to you.
No, you're right in a sense. I mean, we look at a complete relationship. So we'll do an art loan for a client, but you're right. We want to do the trust. We want to work with them in lots of different ways. We want to negotiate at auction for them. We want to manage their investment accounts. The one unique issue in Europe is that the legal structure really hasn't been put in place yet. It's more difficult to do art lending in Europe as well as in Great Britain. I think we're seeing some discussions at certain levels, both within the EU as well as within the common currency regime, to get that infrastructure in place. So I see the next 20 years, Europe will be a great growth market for this. Right now, it's very tiny compared to the US.
Hang on, please.
Because of the lien and UCC filing, obviously US is way ahead of us in Europe. Evan and I, we discussed it, but in Europe, obviously, there's some development to address it. What about Asia? Because this seems to me a huge growth market. What about, Asia in terms of how can the lender secure, that their art loan is fine? In US, it's quite clear. In Europe, it's still not there. What about Asia?
The reality is that Asia per se, it doesn't mean much, meaning that it's a vast continent with multiple judicial systems. I'll tell you that from our perspective, from Athena perspective, Hong Kong and Singapore are deemed to be jurisdictions that are lender-friendly. Subject to possession, I need to have possession that I cannot perfect a lien without having possession. But in other countries, even if I have possession, I may have to go through a judge to then liquidate that asset. For instance, I'm Italian. I would never lend you $1 for an asset that sits physically in Italy, because then when I'm going to go and try to sell it, I need to do through a judge, and it will take you 10 years. So I cannot afford that luxury. Japan, very complex jurisdiction for us. We don't lend if the asset is physically located in Japan. So we focus on where the asset is physically located and where we take custody of that asset versus the actual residence of the borrower himself, subject clearly to a regulatory restriction that in certain countries I may not lend because legally I cannot do that.
Well, interestingly, I learned the hard way. You would think that Switzerland, which does not have a lien filing system, and if you have possession, you're secured, Switzerland would be a lender-friendly jurisdiction. I will tell you it is not. A borrower can default and file bankruptcy, especially if he has a special purpose vehicle which owns the art. And if you get involved in a bankruptcy in Switzerland, good luck.
That's why there's a lot of art in those mountains. There's vaults galore throughout history,
Well, in the
Switzerland.
No, in the Freeport. I'm talking about Switzerland itself.
Yeah.
Freeport is another story. We kept a lot of our collateral in the freeports of Zurich and Geneva over the years because they were not within the Swiss jurisdiction. If there were a borrower default, if there's a borrower default, you go pick it up and you take it back to London.
I suggest a symposium about free ports.
And that's the last word. Thank you all very much.